So good afternoon, everyone. Indeed, I'm Emmanuel Viale, so I'm leading the Accenture labs in Sophia Antipolis in the south of France. So like my people before inviting to go to Tokyo, to Germany, you're also welcome to come to the south of France. It's as sunny as here. We have a large technology park, and also we happen to, for now, more than 25 years, having our labs. So in the next few minutes, what I wanted to do is share a bit indeed about those topics around traceability, counterfeiting, etc., and the use of blockchain, and try to make it tangible by sharing, and we're going to try to connect live to our lab to actually show in action some examples of live POCs actually out of existing experimentations we've done on the field to show and share a bit of the technical approaches. I won't bore you with this, but at least show between public versus private, permissionless systems and what we have done. So just here a few words. So Accenture is a very large company, global one, 425,000, 100,000 employees around the globe. We do professional services, and we have, in consulting, which historically has been our work, technology, operations, digital, and strategy. But for the past 4 years, we've been very active in blockchain, indeed discovering, like most of us, here today, the cryptocurrency, Bitcoin aspect, but rapidly shifting and looking also on the other applications. And this whole area, I would say, of traceability, supply chain, some part of manufacturing as well, are some of them easy use cases for applications. But when you start to dig, of course, depending on the standards, depending on the industries, depending on the regulations, depending on the existing ecosystem, this is where, of course, it gets tricky, interesting, challenging at the same time. And of course, from a technical standpoint, where there's a number of challenges to go through as well. So this is not working. So maybe you can go, okay, perfect. So that was what I was saying, just where we have labs around the globe. So the one highlighted, not so far from here geographically, is where I come from. But you can see we have different focus. But we're working, for example, in China. Our colleagues in Beijing are also quite active in blockchain. In Israel as well, from a cybersecurity standpoint, and other locations. Now, in terms of areas where we're looking, and I think it's been addressed already, or touched on in the previous sections. We see this whole catalog of use cases and applications, each leading to, of course, its own, what are the actual, technical aspects. What was mentioned before this morning in the survey. Will it scale? Will it handle the volume of, for example, in all the IoT scenarios? Will it handle the volume of logs from RFID or logs from, temperature sensors, etc. At the top, of course, where we see a lot of action today, and where there is, in particular, I'll focus a bit on trade finance because it's interesting, but also it applies in the approach to a number of other use cases in the way blockchain can be used, or actually more broadly, distributed ledgers can be used to tackle sort of some of the inefficiencies or revisit completely some of the existing ecosystems. Some were mentioned already, around private records, back to the previous session around privacy, for example, and the good balance between privacy and at the same time sharing of data, global data protection regulation, right to be forgotten. So revolve around some form of identity, which we find technically afterwards in also how to identify a container, identify a parcel, identify something, and use blockchain or not, and what sort of data do we put inside the blockchain or outside, etc. So it was just to a bit now that I'm going to zoom and narrow it in terms of where, for the sake of this presentation, in particular in the supply chain space. But that's sort of a way to classify, again, the use cases. And behind, of course, as part of the labs that I lead around blockchain, we look at the technical aspects. Again, back to some of the question in the audience before, do you go on a public blockchain or private, permissionless? Do you use tokens or tokenization, or just as a distributed ledger for messaging between the different systems? Do you use smart contracts? Do you put the logic outside, etc.? That's, of course, every time what we're trying to look from a technical aspect combined with the business elements. So here for the last 10 minutes, I'll try to introduce a couple of use cases. So narrowing down, and here it's unreadable on purpose, especially the slide or the miniature on the side. But this is, I think what's interesting around trade finance is it encompasses, the supply chain at the top, flow of goods from the ordering, the manufacturing, storing, etc., where there is a physical element, and we've seen in the previous presentations already some good examples, or at least announcements. But also what's interesting, it's the flow of documents and the payment. So you can imagine here it's quite, I would say, a good use case, at least to start testing and looking at where blockchain can apply. Because do you want to use a mix with between the for the flow of funds, so essentially the payment aspect? Do you want to use blockchain for this, or include into the overall blockchain for this reference to the payments, or the transactional aspect, or the flow of documents as well? So here in the demo I'm going to show you, which is extracted from actually a first pilot we did more than a year ago. We have actually put the metadata inside the blockchain, but reference some other aspects. So for example, we don't put when something is produced and is being stored and then being shipped, we don't put every single data element into the blockchain. We refer to it. However, it's seen essentially as one sort of workflow for that particular parcel in this case, and we follow the life cycle. I'll show you, we have used smart contract in some example. In the demo I'm going to show you we've used smart contract to fully track and the life cycle essentially of the corresponding object, or what we're tracking, and reference also some of the metadata, in particular all the bill of lading, the letter of credit, and everything that goes today. What's interesting with this is also, again, in general, when you look at the blockchain, is you take an existing process which has grown over the years for multiple reasons, whether it's something in one particular industry, or that includes several industries, like on here, where you can you have shipment companies, supply chain companies, retailers, producers, banks, etc. You easily can count to 10 different players. And what are the standards that are the way things are done today, and where you can look at inefficiency. So use blockchain essentially, and I have next slide where I'll touch on this, but to look at the incremental evolution of something that we have today. But discussing this with a client a couple of months ago, they said, well, why do we need a letter of credit? So of course there are good reasons today why we need to, we have letter of credits, and why this is how it is. But I think also looking at, by starting with this in terms of approach, is interesting to say, well, the business case, the use case will be here. The business case will be there because you're having an efficiency play. You're doing things faster at a lower cost, etc. But that then can be the basis for completely revisiting this particular process and actually changing the way things are done. And I think I like also this aspect because it's gradually, it's not a complete disruption. It's, I would say, an incremental disruption, if that makes any sense. At least it's a good way as well to take a look. So here, just double-clicking on, if you have been following on the shipping side, again, zooming, so I took a very large overview of use cases, then starting to put it in the context, for example, of trade finance, which includes different, the documentation, the contractualization aspect, the payment, and also the supply chain. And then, for example, in the shipping here, I'll let you read through the slide, but if you compare, today and with blockchain, you will notice there isn't a whole lot of differences. But if you look at some of the chevrons here, you will see that it essentially allows for avoiding counterfeiting and fraud. That's one. Second, reconciliation, which is, I would say, something we find with blockchain, avoiding reconciliation or doing real-time settlement in the broad sense of the term, not in necessarily purely for payments, is really where it makes a big difference. So you will see in some chevrons where it's actually we see a whole lot of value, and in order to really automate and put it in the, I think, a good context for blockchain. Afterwards, of course, the questions comes from a technical standpoint. We talked about blockchain. We use also more and more distributed ledgers. So I think it's also a variation of blockchain that we see more and more. So how you can have data that pertain to the shipment company, then to the customs, for example, and you don't necessarily have to spread across, all the transactions to anyone and everyone in the same ecosystem. That also can help with some form of privacy or competitive advantage, even though the data can be protected, encrypted, etc. So that's an example now. And just last point, I see still 5 minutes and 30 seconds to at least try to bring this to life with a live connection. Also something, again, I hinted at, and it was mentioned in the previous discussions, is also how you connect, of course, what's happening, for example, in food traceability between the farm, the cooperative, then the distribution side of things, to have a full traceability. Full traceability, of course, for the end consumer. I know that I'm eating, this or that food, and it comes from this or that farm or area, whatever. And at the same time, of course, for efficiency, and supply chain management for the retailer, for example, in this example. What's important here, and again, it's a very naive scenario because here it looks at putting all sorts of sensor data directly in blocks, etc. This is something that we can start to achieve right now, but it's I would say something we wouldn't do, putting every single data coming from every single sensor along the way here into the blockchain. And also, of course, I think once data, RFID, tag ID, and antenna ID, and whatever is in the blockchain, then it's fully traceable, secured, etc. However, what if there is a spoof device or some other, ways to falsify the info before it gets into the blockchain? That's also something we are looking at. So smart oracles was mentioned before. It's one way to fully secure, from the data capture into the blockchain. But there are other advances in technologies, again, track and trace technologies, to also make it secure from the very source, what's happening on the field, what are we detecting, all the way to the blockchain. In the last 4 minutes, if you can switch over to maximize. So we see Hugo. Hugo, can you say hi just to prove you're alive? Yeah, very good.
Hello, everyone.
So, Hugo, we have 3 minutes and 40 seconds to show a trade finance demo end-to-end. So maybe you can, so here this is a mini lab. So we have this lab where we start to test in real and also outside in a nearby a field where we can test stuff for semi-real conditions at least. You see a cobot, so Baxter behind, he's taking mini parcels equipped with tag IDs, and he's actually looking at what if we were in the warehouse. But maybe you go, if you switch to the other side here, and just to show a couple of screens, and this scenario I was showing before very quickly around trade finance, where we want to show how we can use blockchain when we initiate, for example, the import-export, or export-import of plank of woods, for example, and want to make sure that the letter of credit, all the paper side of things is done properly, but also you render the data visible. If you double-click on the lower screen, so it switched between, there. So here, this is the screen, and this is, let's say, a French furniture manufacturer who is ordering planks of wood. So here again, nothing, just a standard user interface, of course, as usual. But behind, we're posting the data, the product order, etc., inside the blockchain. So again, nothing fancy here. It's actually, as usual with blockchain, it should be the same for any user interface for the end user, and they won't hack around, of course, inside the blockchain. Next, and again, we're for the sake of time, fast forwarding. If you change, you go to the next tab. So now it goes to the correspondent, the bank in France that will issue the letter of credit. So again here, and again, it's not, it's semi-technical on purpose because this is actually the metadata that I was alluding to before. In this case, where we're putting this into the smart contract, and this sort of 20 plus 30 metadata go into the blockchain is only visible to, for example, here the bank, because the bank has a relationship with this customer, the manufacturer, and vice versa here, so accepting, validating, and all the rest of the data is either encrypted or protected with different levels. So it can be zero knowledge proof, it can be purely encryption at the data level inside the blockchain, but the point is how you can make sure that the data goes inside the blockchain. Here, the banker validates. It can be also automated. And when you switch the view, maybe to the Chinese bank, it's a French to China import-export. Again, here, you'll have to trust me if it's readable or not, but only the data that pertain to this transaction is visible to this bank for its customer and the customer of its customer. And you see at all times what is done, what's happening. At this stage here, again, the shipment hasn't been registered, but maybe let's simulate through Baxter, Hugo, that this is happening in real. And afterwards, essentially, we go through the process. So if you can, finalize Hugo. And afterwards, so you need to swap again, double click. So here we play to make sure that the proper tag ID, which was referenced in the ordering through some simple mechanism, is able to actually be verified. So we want to make sure that actually the pallet of woods that is shipped is actually the one, or whatever the container, is actually the one that was pre-registered. There can be many ways, again, about track and trace for this. If we switch back, Hugo, just to finish the demo and show what's on top the Blockchain Explorer, if you enlarge the view. If you hear me again, if it's not frozen or not cut. Yeah, there we go. And maybe you can share the Blockchain Explorer at the top here. So this is unreadable, that's on purpose. That's really the technical view. In this demo, we have more than 7 million or so blocks. Again, the count doesn't matter. It used to matter 2 years ago, where after a couple of hours or a bit more, the demo would simply not work anymore. Now it scales easily, and you have references to the blocks, the transactions, the data, and then the metadata encoded in here. Just swap back to the presentation. Thank you, Hugo. So that's it. Now I have 5 minutes to answer questions if you have any. But that was, again, just to summarize, present again a number of use cases that pertain in this whole, I would say, enterprise world, where you can start with a efficiency play, how we do things with a lot of paper, with a lot of reconciliation, sometimes manual, sometimes semi-automated, and at the same time, when we need to share much more quickly between different organizations, different countries at a global level, I think blockchain is a very good candidate. But there are, again, a number of challenges I mentioned, some, of course, technical, being resolved, and mostly, obviously, the big one is what is the ecosystem? What are the new players? What are the roles, and how to redistribute in this particular example? Thank you.
How does Accenture make money out of this? Is this a research project, and how are you going to monetize?
So very good question. We monetize because we actually work with work with different startups or different consortia in the blockchain space, part of Hyperledger, for example. So we help our clients transform, and for example, in these industries, whether it's the retail industry, supply chain, etc., the shipping industry as well. That's the type of solutions all bundled together, and then how we make money is by what I said at the beginning, introducing the company with consulting, strategy, implementation, and even operating when and where it makes sense. So it's not just for having fun, which is my job essentially, but also to enable, of course, the different industries and our clients in the different industries that we serve to see what are the possibilities, but not just remain theoretical, rapidly to test and go on the field, try to test and test the technical aspect all the way to, of course, rapidly the regulatory, the legal aspect even that were mentioned in the previous sessions.
Hi, Emmanuel. Thanks for the talk. My question would be, I have two questions. The first one is, how did you scale? And question two would be, in a very simple form, what is the difference between tracking using blockchain versus tracking using a shared Google document?
So the first, how to scale? The first one, well, technically, again, that's here in this very simple example, we are putting we're referencing data which doesn't have to be on the blockchain. And we are putting some data that is required for everyone to see. So that's more of a technical choice. There are several aspects. One is like any architecture, any system that you design, what sort of data is stored to that blockchain, what is really needed to be shared, to be visible with what I said before with some of the restrictions, protection, privacy, etc. vs what is actually not necessary to put on the blockchain. And second is the scalability. If we were to track every single parcel or plank of wood around the world, well, rapidly it's exponential, and we would need to not do what we did, which was put the RFID events as part of the metadata that correspond to the traceability aspect of the plank. So here, that's again, try to be short. That's the different elements. The second, which was vs Google document. So I think it's here it's general for enterprise applications of blockchains. It's how you can onboard and offboard very quickly, new participants. In an easy way. So I would say, if you have a centralized platform, well, first comes the question of the governments. Who would own? Is it yet another consortium or some form of company that would own the servers and everything that everyone would connect to? And then you have a whole lot of operations to essentially, like I said, onboard, offboard, archive, create new accounts, etc. Then APIs, lightweight architecture to integrate with all the consuming app. Part of this remained the same with blockchain. The big difference is, again, out of the box, blockchain would bring over time that you have the visibility on the data that you were supposed to or involved in, in the transactions that you were involved in. And you don't need to manage this afterwards. So the life cycle might be easier. And afterwards, it becomes also, in terms of the platform itself, easier to revoke nodes, for example, if they become corrupted or whatever. And at the same time, there's a failover capacity, because if a node is down, well, the rest of the system will work. Now, questions will come if this node is a validating node or some, but again, with the redundancy, you have some advantages. But that's a very good point, which is always even ourselves say, why blockchain? What it is that it will bring that you cannot do today with a more traditional approach.
About a year ago, Accenture proposed a blockchain technology which allows to patch the history. So write operations on the blockchain. Does that still exist?
So I was expecting this question to come much earlier. But no, so here, so it's not to patch, it's actually called redactable blockchain. So the point was for a specific class of use cases where you are in an enterprise setting and typically a permission setting, and where either in the design you have made, one simple way is to say, well, there was a erroneous transaction or record in a block, 50,000 blocks away. We spotted that error. It was maybe a fat finger error or some form of logic calculation or a bug like we have. So either in the design you say, well, I patch and this new transaction is actually overriding the other one, and you're done, no problem. But in some cases we realize that you still need to go back, or sometimes you need to erase. Right to be forgotten is typically the case. You need to erase or patch the data. So what the invention is all about is how, again, under the supervision of the governance of that blockchain system. So it's not like we would go on Bitcoin and erase anything. It's not for that class of applications of blockchain. But in an enterprise setting where there is a governance put in place and people agree that there should be this feature, we are able to essentially see it as a second dimension in the block. So where you mark some blocks as scarred and they say this one has been edited, we know the reasons. Now you can keep the blocks on the side. So this was the erroneous block that we had, or for one particular transaction, and you can patch it if you want. You can keep or remove the actual data. That depends on the governance. So that still exists. We have working prototype and solution for this, but it's again only in a certain, because I've been hit by purists, and I am one of them. So, but it's for a certain class of applications, it wouldn't work in a public permissionless system. Well, we could, but it's not the purpose, the point.
Okay, let's thank the speaker.
Thanks.